Hello everybody, this is how to make a quote sandwich. Now if you are already familiar with a quote sandwich, you can go all the way to the end of this. If you have never done it before and this is your first experience with it, stop when we get to the bottom bun part. I'll explain why in a bit. So, the brass tacks. A quote sandwich is just a handy little tool. Quite frankly, it's kind of silly, right? Like quote sandwich, that's kind of childish. That's why we use it. It's a handy way to remember it. It's an easy way to remember how to write a good paragraph. And by a good paragraph, what I mean is that we have evidence. We are able to analyze what we're talking about and have a single focus. So we look at what information goes into the paragraph. We think about the quote that we use. We think about the analysis we use. We also think about our focus. A quote sandwich, as I just mentioned, has one thought. A paragraph is a single thought. That's the focus of our paragraph, just to analyze that one thought. And then finally, organization. What order we present our information in. This is a sandwich. God, it's delicious. I'm allergic to cheese, but everything else is great. What we see there is we have two pieces of bread, we have some lettuce, what is that? Tomato, onions, cheese, and I think that's turkey. Pretty good looking. And that's a kind of a visual representation of what a good paragraph needs to look like. So, any good sandwich always has a top bun or a top slice of bread. Now, this is your idea. This is the thought, the single thought that you need to do. In a larger essay, the top bun is the idea which supports your thesis. A thesis statement is one in which you have 3 supporting points. This is one of those supporting points. Unless the top bun is just the top bun of a paragraph that exists all by itself, in which case there are some other things you need to do. You have to include information like the title of the work you're looking at. You need to include information like its author, and this is just if you're dealing with literature of any type. Next, you have the tomato, which is context to set up your quote. Context is background information. What information does your reader need to have in order to understand what this quote means? The person reading your writing has read the text you're referring to, so keep it simple. Keep it at that. If they have not read the text you're referring to, they're either not bothering to read your essay anyway, in which case you're not writing for them, or in the case of a larger essay, perhaps you have a works cited page at the end, in which case if they want to read that text, they can go read that text. But you don't have to sum it up. You don't have to say, here's what this whole text is about. Keep it as simple as you can. 1 to 1.5 sentences. That's it. Now, if you're using literature, if you're using a book or a short story or a memoir or a poem or anything like that, and you're analyzing literary merit, the tomato is also usually where you put that literary term that you're focusing on. If you're talking about conflict, this is where you say conflict. Unless your top bun has already stated it. So at this point, let's back up a little bit and think about what we have so far. A top bun and a tomato. So let's pretend. A lot of you guys have read The Most Dangerous Game at this point, so that's an easy one to work with. Let's say I want to write a quote sandwich about The Most Dangerous Game, and the quote sandwich is going to use the quote I've picked out. It's called, "I am a beast at bay." And that's a line from the very end of the story. My top bun, if it were just a paragraph existing all by itself, would say something along the lines of, in Richard Connell's short story, The Most Dangerous Game, Rainsford has become a monster. Your tomato would say something along the lines of, this can be seen in the author's use of conflict when Rainsford at the end of the story says, done. That's the end of your tomato. Sometimes by context, we don't even mean setting up the quote in any kind of conventional way. It might be a bridger to logical thinking which gets you to your quote. And this is especially true if you are writing about things that's your own idea. For those of you who are writing, for example, a persuasive essay, if you're writing about the death penalty, maybe your top bun would say the death penalty should be abolished because too many innocent people are convicted. Your tomato, rather than setting up the article that you're reading or anything like that, would be your own thinking. Maybe it's, if your quote is going to be a statistic where you're saying, 79% of those convicted of capital murder are innocent. Okay, your tomato is just a sentence and a half of setting up that quote. And it could be less than a sentence and a half. It could be 3 words. Those of you who get to senior level writing, college level writing, maybe you don't even have a tomato sometimes. That's fine. But as a generality, you want to have a tomato of some type. Next is the lettuce. That's your quote. With your citation, you always include a citation in text. Always. There is a caveat to that. We'll get to that in a little bit. But for the most part, when you're citing something, when you're referring to a quote from a book or a quote from an article or a quote from a poem, you always have a citation in text. In MLA format, the citation is a parentheses with the last name of the author and the page number. If there is no author, then you don't include an author. You would just have a truncated version of the title, like 1 or 2 words of it. And if you have no page number, then you just don't include page numbers. But when all things being equal, if you have an author and a page number, you include both. If you do not have both in there, if you, for example, you're using the Richard Connell short story Most Dangerous Game, and you did not give the author and the page number, that's bad. Now, of course, if you think back to the very beginning of this little let's wrap up and start a quote sandwich, I did say the author's name in my top bun, which means I wouldn't have to say the author's name in my parentheses. I would just say the page number. Your cheese. Cheese I consider to be less important, and I say that personally just because I'm allergic to cheese. I don't eat cheese, except on pizza, and it hurts. But cheese is generally, it's kind of like a required option. It's a return to your focus. Your focus is your thesis. In the case of a single paragraph, it's your top bun. In the case of a larger essay, it's your thesis. The big top guy at the top. Then, of course, we have our meat. Our meat is an analysis. An analysis is a big word which just means walk me through how your quote proves your top bun is true. This means you're going to be looking at all sorts of stuff. You're going to be talking about the word connotations. If you're talking about a piece of literature, what is the connotation of beast at bay, for example? A beast, it's very negative, it's very animalistic. You're also going to be talking about literary merit. If you're using a literary term or a piece of figurative language, you need to talk about how is this a metaphor? How is this conflict? In the case of I'm a beast at bay, it would be an internal conflict that demonstrates that he has become the animal within. Also, how does it prove the top bun? In the case of a larger essay, if you're writing a 5-paragraph essay or something even bigger, you would also need to say how this top bun helps you to prove your thesis. Then there's one more thing that we'll get to in just a minute. That one more thing, again, if you've never done a quote sandwich before, you can just stop when we get to that one more thing and don't worry about it. For those of you who have done this before, you're going to want to know it. Next, you have a bottom bun. It's a concluding sentence. In a single paragraph essay, it would be really, really simple, and the easiest way to do it would be, therefore, restate your top bun. In a larger essay, you can get more creative. In a larger essay, you don't need to say therefore at the end of every paragraph. There are a lot of different ways to do it. You could say something like, in this way, Rainsford has shown that he has become a monster. Something like that. When you get real big, senior year, that kind of thinking, you can start using that as a transition into your next paragraph. So this is the point. This is it right here. This is the new stuff, the stuff that if you are familiar with a quote sandwich from the very beginning of the year, you've never done this before. And here's the thing. What if I have 2 quotes that prove the same thing? What if I have 2 pieces of evidence and they both show the same thing? They're both a piece of conflict. They both show that Rainsford has become a monster, and I want to use both of them. I don't know which one to use. Well, there's a way to do it. Look at that boy. That is a sandwich. That is my kind of sandwich. That thing weighs like 2 pounds. I guarantee it. I don't know. I took this off of Google, but I am hopeful that it is 2 pounds. I see, God, there looks like there's a tomato in there somewhere. It's a little tiny slice. Looks like there's, that's bacon. I think that's bacon right there. Bread, there's mustard, there's mayo. That is, I believe that's pastrami. Oh, God, that looks good, doesn't it? That is my kind of sandwich. And that's what you're really working to write, with a bigger paragraph that uses multiple pieces of evidence. So here's how we do it. We have a top bun, we have a tomato, we have lettuce, we have cheese, we have meat, and then at the end of the meat, we have to divide it up a little bit. So we have another piece of tomato, and then we have some bacon. Oh, bacon on a sandwich, yes! And then more meat. And finally, we have a bottom bun to kind of hold it all together because, as you all know, a sandwich is nothing more than a receptacle to get meat into your stomach. That's what it's for. So, meat, bacon, meat. Yes. Tomato 2, in this case, it sets up your second quote. The reason I made this little video in the first place is because we are doing Of Mice and Men, and I'm asking you to write an essay using the novel as well as a documentary as your source. So the novel would be your first quote, Well, you have that documentary to deal with too. So you need a second tomato, in order to set up your second quote. Now, this tomato, just like the first tomato, it could be anything. If you're using two quotes from a single book, maybe you are talking about, oh, later on in the book when Curly decides to go kill Lenny, this happens. Again, keep it real simple, keep it vague. It can even be a sentence at the most. It doesn't have to be huge. And then you get your bacon. And that's the quote from your second source. At this point, I need to point out, it doesn't have to be a quote. It could be a paraphrase from your second source. In the Dust Bowl documentary, there was a really, really touching moment where an old man was talking about how his sister died when she was 4 from pneumonia as a result of the dust in the air. And he said she was perfect. Now, I don't remember if that's exactly what he said, but that's essentially what he said. I don't have the movie in front of me, but I do have my notes, and I pointed that out, how he cried. Maybe that's what my bacon will be. Maybe my bacon will be just a sentence where I describe that moment where he broke down and cried, and I have an in-text citation, again, following the same MLA format of the author and the page number. If I said the author previously, again, I don't have to say it again in the parentheses, but if I didn't say it, then I do have to say it there. Finally, I have to do meat again, more meat. And again, any connotations as needed, any literary merit as needed, how it relates to that previous quote. I need to go back and say, here's how it relates to my previous quote, and here's why they're related. I also have to say how this quote helps to prove that other quote, how this paraphrase I'm doing helps to prove that other quote, and finally, how this top bun helps to prove my thesis. How is it all related? How does it all fit together? At this point, I need to point out, this is all couched, again, in literary stuff, but it doesn't just apply to literary stuff. It can be used for any style of writing with very little modification. Those of you who have me as seniors, I have the same thing. I just call it something else. It can even be used for paragraphs that don't use a quote. So later on, as you write more and more and more, you can make a quote sandwich without a quote. Your lettuce is just not a quote, it's a paraphrase, or it's a statistic. It could be anything. The style stays the same. And that's how you're left with this. Oh, wow. Apparently that thing weighs 22 pounds. And see on the left there, that little sad sandwich? You want to make the one on the right, not the one on the left. A good paragraph is beefy. A good paragraph has a lot of meat in it. That's what you want to do. The end.